Ever heard a confession that could topple a crown? Step into Madrid's palace at midnight. Incense, stone, and a girl writing secrets no priest will touch. Her name is Isabella Clara Eugenia, and her diary maps a family's darkest rites: inbreeding, coercion, and a circle sworn to silence. Ready to read the pages Spain spent centuries burying? Before diving into these forbidden chronicles of desire and destruction, if you enjoy learning about the hidden scandals that shaped European history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these dark chapters together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the secrets that powerful families tried desperately to bury. Isabella's childhood was spent in the Alcazar of Madrid, a palace where every room held mysteries and every corridor whispered of conspiracies. Her father, Philip II, ruled an empire so vast that the sun never set on Spanish territories. Yet within his own family, darkness gathered like storm clouds. Isabella grew up surrounded by portraits of her ancestors, their distinctive Habsburg jaw becoming more pronounced with each generation, their eyes holding secrets that would have horrified their subjects. The young Archduchess was considered one of the most beautiful women in Europe, her pale skin and golden hair making her the subject of countless marriage proposals from kings and princes across the continent. But beauty in the Habsburg court came with a terrible price. Isabella's education included not just languages and music, but lessons in a different kind of courtly behavior. Behind closed doors, away from the prying eyes of ambassadors and church officials, she learned that royal blood followed different rules than common morality. Her governess, Doña Catalina de Mendoza, was a woman whose own family had served the Habsburgs for generations. Catalina understood the unspoken traditions that bound the royal bloodline together. She taught Isabella that purity of blood was more important than purity of soul, that family loyalty transcended earthly laws, and that certain sacrifices were expected from those born to rule. These lessons, delivered in whispered conversations during long winter evenings, would plant seeds that would bloom into something monstrous. Isabella's diary, written in a cipher she developed herself, begins innocuously enough. Early entries describe court ceremonies, diplomatic visits, and her frustrations with the rigid protocol that governed every moment of her existence. But between the lines of these mundane observations, darker themes begin to emerge. She writes of feeling isolated, of being surrounded by people yet utterly alone, of desires she couldn't name or understand. The Habsburg court was a world unto itself, where normal social boundaries dissolved in the face of divine right and absolute power. Isabella's uncles and cousins moved through the palace like predators, their royal blood giving them license to pursue whatever pleased them. The Archduchess learned early that resistance was futile, that her body belonged not to herself, but to the dynasty that had created her. Her first confession appears in an entry dated March 15th, 1580. She writes of a night when her uncle, Archduke Ernst, visited her chambers under the pretense of discussing her upcoming betrothal to the Archduke Albert of Austria. But the conversation quickly turned to other matters. Ernst, she records, spoke of the special bonds that united Habsburg blood, of how their family's purity required certain rituals to maintain its strength. What follows in Isabella's diary is a descent into a world where family devotion becomes something unspeakable. She describes encounters that began as lessons in royal duty but evolved into something far more sinister. Her uncle Ernst, she writes, convinced her that their family's divine mandate required them to keep their blood completely pure, that mixing with outsiders would weaken the Habsburg line and ultimately destroy their empire. The young Archduchess, isolated from normal human relationships and raised to believe that her family's will was God's will, gradually accepted these twisted justifications. Her diary entries become increasingly detailed as she records not just events, but her own psychological transformation. She describes learning to separate her mind from her body during these encounters, to think of herself not as Isabella but as a vessel for Habsburg destiny. The cipher she used to protect these confessions was remarkably sophisticated for its time. Using a combination of Latin, coded Spanish, and symbols of her own creation, Isabella created a private language that allowed her to record truths too dangerous for anyone else to read. Modern scholars who have studied her diary suggest that she may have been one of the most intelligent women of her generation. Her brilliant mind trapped in circumstances that would have destroyed a lesser intellect. As Isabella matured, her diary reveals that the abuse she suffered was not limited to a single family member. The Habsburg court operated according to its own moral code, where royal blood granted access to whatever its bearers desired. Her father, Philip II, consumed with ruling his vast empire and fighting wars across Europe, remained either ignorant of what was happening in his own palace or chose to look the other way, rather than confront truths that would shatter his dynasty. The Archduchess writes of developing strategies to cope with her situation. She learned to predict which family members would approach her and when, developing elaborate systems of avoidance that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. She describes hiding in the palace's secret passages, passages built centuries earlier for escape during sieges but now used by a desperate young woman trying to escape her own family. Her diary entries from this period reveal a mind struggling to maintain sanity in impossible circumstances. She writes of conversations with saints, of visions that may have been divine intervention or psychological breaks from reality. She records detailed descriptions of religious ecstasies that seem to coincide with her worst trauma, as if her mind created spiritual experiences to shield her from earthly horrors. The political implications of Isabella's situation were staggering. As one of the most eligible princesses in Europe, her purity was not just a personal matter, but a diplomatic necessity. Marriage negotiations with foreign powers depended on her virtue being beyond question. Yet the very family members responsible for protecting that virtue were systematically destroying it behind palace walls. Isabella's diary reveals that she was not the only victim of these twisted family dynamics. She writes of younger cousins and nieces who disappeared from court life, sent to convents or remote castles when their usefulness ended, or when they became inconvenient reminders of family shame. The Habsburg bloodline, so prized for its purity, was being corrupted from within by the very people charged with protecting it. The young Archduchess began to understand that her diary was more than just a record of personal trauma. It was evidence of crimes that could topple kingdoms, of sins that would horrify the Catholic Church that supported her family's rule. She started writing with increasing detail and precision, as if she knew that someday these words would serve as testimony against those who had wronged her. Her entries describe the psychological techniques her abusers used to maintain control over her. They convinced her that speaking of these matters would destroy not just her own reputation, but the stability of the empire itself. They reminded her constantly that millions of subjects depended on Habsburg rule, that her silence was a patriotic duty more important than her own welfare. Yet even as Isabella submitted to these arguments, her diary reveals a growing awareness of the true nature of her situation. She began to see through the elaborate justifications and recognize the abuse for what it was. This growing clarity, rather than bringing relief, brought new forms of torment as she realized the full scope of her entrapment. The Archduchess writes of attempting to confide in her confessor, Father Miguel de los Santos, only to discover that he too was compromised by loyalty to the Habsburg family. When she tried to describe her situation in veiled terms during confession, the priest interrupted her with reassurances that God understood the special burdens placed on royal blood, that earthly rules did not always apply to those chosen to rule in his name. Isabella's isolation was complete. Surrounded by hundreds of courtiers, servants, and family members, she lived in a prison of silence where her suffering could never be acknowledged or addressed. Her diary became her only confidant, the only place where she could speak truthfully about her existence. As the years passed, Isabella's diary entries reveal an even darker truth. The abuse she endured was not random or opportunistic, but part of a deliberate system designed to maintain Habsburg control over their bloodline. Her diary describes discovering a hidden library within the palace walls, accessible through a concealed door behind a portrait of her great-grandmother. This library contained documents that would chill the blood of any decent person. Among the dusty tomes and yellowed parchments, Isabella found records dating back centuries, chronicling the sexual exploitation of Habsburg women as a tool of dynastic control. The documents, written in Latin and Old Spanish, described how keeping the women of the family isolated and dependent ensured their absolute obedience to patriarchal authority. What Isabella had believed was her unique suffering was revealed to be part of a centuries-old tradition of systematic abuse disguised as royal prerogative. The library contained detailed genealogical charts that showed the true extent of Habsburg inbreeding, mapping not just official marriages but the countless unofficial unions between family members that had produced children hidden away in convents and monasteries across Europe. Isabella realized that she was surrounded by half-siblings and cousins whose existence had been erased from official records to maintain the fiction of dynastic purity. Her diary entries from this period show a remarkable transformation in her writing style. The frightened, confused young woman gradually gave way to someone with a cold, analytical understanding of her family's crimes. She began to document not just her own abuse, but the systematic patterns she observed throughout the court. She recorded which family members preyed on servants, which marriages were covers for incestuous relationships, and which children disappeared when they became inconvenient witnesses to family secrets. Isabella discovered that her own planned marriage to Archduke Albert of Austria was not the political alliance it appeared to be, but a carefully orchestrated arrangement to place her under the control of another Habsburg male who had been briefed on her situation. Albert, she learned through intercepted correspondence, had been explicitly told that his future wife required special handling due to her delicate psychological condition, a euphemism that masked the true reason for her supposed fragility. The Archduchess began to understand that her entire life had been structured around maintaining her usefulness to the dynasty, while ensuring her silence about its darkest secrets. Her education in languages and diplomacy was not preparation for queenship, but training to make her a more valuable asset in international negotiations. Her religious instruction was designed not to strengthen her faith, but to convince her that earthly suffering was God's will for those born to royal blood. Her diary reveals that she began to fight back in small, careful ways. She started intercepting letters between family members, copying important documents, and building her own intelligence network among the palace servants who had witnessed crimes but dared not speak of them. Isabella discovered that many of the palace staff were bound to silence, not just by loyalty or fear, but by their own complicity in the system that sustained Habsburg power. She writes of Maria Gonzalez, a serving woman who had worked in the palace for 30 years and had seen countless young women destroyed by the family she served. Maria, Isabella discovered, kept her own secret records of what she had witnessed, hidden beneath floorboards in the servants' quarters. These records corroborated Isabella's experiences and revealed that the abuse extended far beyond the royal family to include courtiers and visiting dignitaries who were granted access to Habsburg women as political favors. The psychological toll of these discoveries pushed Isabella to the edge of madness. Her diary entries become increasingly fragmented and paranoid as she realizes the true scope of the conspiracy surrounding her. She describes sleepless nights spent wondering if every person she encountered was part of the system designed to control and exploit her, if every kindness was calculated manipulation designed to keep her compliant. Yet even as her mental state deteriorated, Isabella's intelligence remained sharp. She began to develop elaborate plans for exposing the truth about her family, schemes that involved smuggling documents to foreign courts, bribing servants to carry messages, and even attempting to contact reformist elements within the Catholic Church who might be willing to challenge Habsburg authority. Her diary reveals that she came closest to escape in 1590 when she attempted to flee the palace disguised as a nun. She had arranged to meet with representatives of the Venetian Republic who had promised to grant her sanctuary in exchange for information about Spanish military plans. But the plot was discovered at the last moment by her uncle Ernst, who had been monitoring her activities more closely than she realized. The punishment for her attempted escape was swift and devastating. Isabella was confined to her chambers for months, allowed contact only with a carefully selected group of servants who reported her every word back to her family. During this imprisonment, she was subjected to what she describes as re-education sessions, designed to break her spirit and convince her that resistance was not only futile but sinful. These sessions, conducted by a combination of family members and loyal priests, used sophisticated psychological techniques to undermine Isabella's sense of reality. They convinced her that her memories of abuse were delusions brought on by excessive pride and insufficient submission to God's will. They told her that her desire for freedom was evidence of demonic influence that required exorcism through physical and spiritual discipline. Isabella's diary entries from this period are among the most heartbreaking in the entire document. She describes her gradual surrender to her captor's interpretation of reality, her growing belief that she was indeed possessed by evil spirits that made her imagine sins that had never occurred. The brilliant young woman who had once planned elaborate escapes began to accept that her suffering was divine punishment for her own wickedness. But even in the depths of this psychological manipulation, Isabella retained enough of her original personality to continue writing in her secret diary. The entries become shorter and more cryptic, but they preserve a record of her true thoughts beneath the facade of submission she presented to her family. She developed an even more complex cipher during this period, one that incorporated religious symbolism and mystical references that would appear to casual observers as the ravings of a religious fanatic. The diary reveals that Isabella's apparent capitulation was at least partially strategic. She learned that complete resistance led only to more severe punishment, while the appearance of submission granted her small freedoms that she could use to gather intelligence and plan for future opportunities. She became a master of deception, presenting herself as a broken, penitent woman, while secretly documenting every crime she witnessed. Her entries describe the arrival of new victims at court, young Habsburg women from distant branches of the family tree who were brought to Madrid under various pretexts. Isabella watched helplessly as these innocent girls underwent the same systematic destruction she had experienced, their confusion and terror triggering memories of her own initiation into the family's dark secrets. She writes of attempting to warn these newcomers through coded messages and subtle gestures, but her reputation as an unstable religious fanatic made her warnings easy to dismiss. The family had successfully transformed her from a potential whistleblower into someone whose testimony would be dismissed as the ravings of a madwoman. The most chilling aspect of Isabella's later diary entries is her growing understanding of how the Habsburg system perpetuated itself across generations. She realized that many of her abusers had themselves been victims in their youth, that the cycle of exploitation created damaged individuals who saw no alternative to continuing the patterns that had destroyed them. The family had created a closed loop of trauma that passed from generation to generation, like a hereditary curse. Isabella's understanding of this generational cycle led her to one of the most disturbing revelations in her entire diary. She discovered that her father, Philip II, the man she had once believed ignorant of her suffering, had himself been a victim of similar abuse during his own youth. Hidden in the secret library, she found his childhood confession, written in his own hand and sealed away like her own diary would be. The document revealed that Philip's cold, calculating nature was not born from natural temperament, but forged in the same fires of family exploitation that were now consuming his daughter. This discovery shattered Isabella's last illusions about her family. She realized that Philip's apparent indifference to her suffering was not ignorance, but a learned survival mechanism. He had taught himself to disconnect from empathy because acknowledging the pain of others would force him to confront his own buried trauma. The empire he ruled with such ruthless efficiency was built not just on military might and political cunning, but on a foundation of psychological damage that stretched back through centuries of Habsburg rule. The diary entries following this revelation show Isabella grappling with a terrible choice. She could continue her secret documentation, preserving evidence of crimes that might someday bring justice to future generations of Habsburg women. Or she could follow her father's path, numbing herself to the horror around her and accepting her role as both victim and eventual perpetrator of the system that had created her. Isabella chose a third option, one that would require her to sacrifice everything she had left of her sanity and soul. She decided to become the perfect Habsburg woman, embracing her role so completely that she would gain unprecedented access to the family's darkest secrets. Her diary describes this transformation with clinical precision, documenting how she learned to smile while being violated, to express gratitude for her abuse, and to recruit new victims with the same techniques that had once been used against her. This psychological metamorphosis was perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Isabella's entire ordeal. Her diary reveals that she discovered a perverse form of power in surrendering completely to the system that had destroyed her. By becoming the most compliant, most enthusiastic participant in Habsburg family traditions, she earned a level of trust that allowed her to witness ceremonies and rituals that had been hidden even from her during her years of resistance. The entries from this period read like dispatches from hell itself. Isabella describes participating in family gatherings that were little more than organized sexual exploitation, where Habsburg women were passed between male relatives like party favors. She records conversations where family members discuss their victims' psychological breaking points with the same casual interest they might show in horse breeding or wine vintages. Most disturbing of all, Isabella's diary reveals that she began to find genuine pleasure in the corruption of innocence. The broken young woman discovered that having power over others, even power granted by her abusers, provided an intoxicating relief from her own helplessness. She writes of selecting new victims from among the palace servants and minor nobility, using her position to identify vulnerable girls who could be drawn into the family's web of exploitation. Her descriptions of these recruitment activities are written with a detached, almost scientific tone that makes them even more chilling. Isabella had learned to view human suffering as data to be collected and analyzed rather than tragedy to be prevented. She developed elaborate psychological profiles of potential victims, documenting their weaknesses, fears, and desires with the thoroughness of a natural philosopher studying insects. The diary reveals that Isabella's apparent madness was at least partially calculated. Her reputation for religious ecstasy and mystical visions provided perfect cover for her true activities. When she claimed to receive divine revelations instructing her to bring certain young women into closer contact with the royal family, her apparent piety made these requests impossible to refuse. Behind this facade of holy inspiration, Isabella was operating a sophisticated intelligence network that rivaled anything her father's spy masters had created. She used her position as a religious mystic to gain access to confessionals, where she learned the secrets of courtiers and visiting dignitaries. She convinced servants that sharing information with her was a form of spiritual cleansing, turning the palace into a vast surveillance apparatus centered on her seemingly harmless religious obsessions. Her diary entries from 1595 reveal the existence of what she calls the Circle of Purification, a secret society within the Habsburg court dedicated to maintaining the family's bloodline through ritualized sexual practices. This organization, which included not just family members but also selected courtiers, clergy, and foreign allies, operated according to elaborate protocols that transformed abuse into religious ceremony. Isabella describes initiation rituals where new members were required to demonstrate their loyalty by participating in increasingly degrading acts. These ceremonies, conducted in hidden chambers beneath the palace, were designed to create unbreakable bonds of mutual complicity. Once someone had participated in the circle's activities, they could never expose the organization without destroying themselves. The diary reveals that the circle's influence extended far beyond the Spanish court. Isabella documents connections to similar organizations in Austria, Bavaria, and other Habsburg territories, suggesting that the sexual exploitation she experienced was part of a Europe-wide network of aristocratic corruption. Letters she intercepted describe the exchange of victims between different branches of the family, with young women being transported across international borders like valuable commodities. Her entries describe the arrival of Maria Anna of Bavaria, a 14-year-old princess who was officially visiting Madrid to negotiate a marriage alliance. In reality, Isabella reveals, Maria Anna was being evaluated for inclusion in the circle's activities. The young princess's innocence and vulnerability made her an ideal candidate for the psychological breaking techniques that the organization had perfected over generations. Isabella's role in Maria Anna's destruction represents the complete corruption of her original character. The woman who had once tried to warn other victims now personally oversaw their initiation into the family's dark traditions. Her diary describes coaching the terrified princess through her first encounters with older male relatives, teaching her the same dissociation techniques that had once preserved Isabella's own sanity. The clinical detail with which Isabella records these sessions reveals how thoroughly she had internalized the Habsburg family's view of human beings as tools to be used and discarded. She describes Maria Anna's psychological collapse with the same dispassionate interest she might show in documenting the symptoms of a disease, noting which techniques produced the most complete submission and which left the victim with dangerous levels of residual independence. Yet, even as Isabella participated in these horrors, her diary suggests that some part of her original personality remained buried beneath layers of psychological damage and calculated adaptation. She began leaving subtle clues in her entries, references that would be meaningless to casual readers but might someday help future investigators understand the true nature of what had occurred in the Habsburg palaces. These hidden messages, embedded in seemingly innocent descriptions of court life and religious experiences, created a secondary narrative within her diary. While the surface text documented her participation in family crimes, the coded subtext preserved evidence of coercion, manipulation, and systematic abuse that could potentially be used to expose the entire network of exploitation. Isabella's growing skill at this double-layered writing reflected her understanding that her diary might outlive the dynasty that had created it. She began to see herself not just as a victim or perpetrator, but as a witness whose testimony might someday serve justice. This sense of purpose, however twisted by years of abuse, provided her with enough psychological stability to continue functioning in circumstances that would have destroyed a lesser mind. The diary entries from 1598 describe Isabella's most ambitious project: the creation of a comprehensive archive documenting the Habsburg family's crimes across multiple generations. Using her access to the secret library and her network of informants throughout the palace, she began compiling a detailed record of sexual exploitation, murder, and corruption that stretched back to the family's earliest days in Spain. This archive, which she called the True History of Habsburg Glory, was hidden in multiple locations throughout the palace and its grounds. Isabella created an elaborate system of cross-references and backup copies, ensuring that even if some portions were discovered and destroyed, enough evidence would survive to damn the dynasty that had created such suffering. Her work on this project required her to interview elderly servants and minor courtiers who had witnessed decades of family crimes. Isabella used her reputation for religious devotion to frame these conversations as spiritual counseling sessions, encouraging people to confess their knowledge of past sins in order to achieve divine forgiveness. The information she gathered through these sessions painted a picture of systematic corruption that extended far beyond sexual exploitation. Isabella documented murders disguised as accidents, political assassinations carried out by family members, and financial crimes that had impoverished entire regions of Spain to fund the dynasty's excesses. Her diary reveals that she began to see herself as an instrument of divine justice, chosen by God to preserve evidence of crimes that earthly authorities were too corrupt or intimidated to investigate. This religious framework provided her with the psychological justification needed to continue her dangerous work, while maintaining her facade as a loyal family member. The most dangerous aspect of Isabella's archive project was her decision to document the involvement of foreign allies and church officials in Habsburg crimes. Her diary describes gathering evidence of corruption within the highest levels of the Catholic Church, including bishops and cardinals who had participated in or covered up the family's sexual exploitation of women and children. These revelations put Isabella in mortal danger. She had moved beyond documenting family secrets to exposing an international conspiracy that involved some of the most powerful people in Europe. Her diary entries from this period show increasing paranoia as she realized that her activities had attracted the attention of individuals with the resources and motivation to silence her permanently. The psychological strain of living this double life while maintaining her archive project began to take its toll on Isabella's already fragile mental state. Her diary entries become increasingly disjointed and filled with religious imagery that may have been genuine mystical experiences or symptoms of complete psychological breakdown. Yet even in the midst of what appeared to be madness, Isabella continued her methodical documentation of crimes and corruption. She developed increasingly sophisticated codes and hiding places, creating a legacy that would survive even if she did not. Her diary had evolved from a personal confession into a weapon of historical justice, one that would someday expose the truth about one of Europe's most powerful dynasties. The winter of 1600 brought changes to the Spanish court that would test Isabella's carefully constructed facade in ways she had never anticipated. Her diary entries from this period reveal that a new confessor had arrived at the palace, Father Antonio de Córdoba, a Jesuit priest whose reputation for intellectual rigor and moral inflexibility preceded him from Rome. Unlike the compliant clergy who had served the Habsburg family for generations, Father Antonio showed disturbing signs of independence and genuine religious conviction. Isabella's first encounter with this new confessor, recorded in meticulous detail, reveals the depth of her psychological transformation over the years. She describes approaching the confessional with the same calculated performance she had perfected with previous priests, ready to deliver carefully crafted admissions that would satisfy religious requirements, while revealing nothing of substance. But Father Antonio's probing questions and unexpected insights caught her completely off guard. The priest, she writes, seemed to see through the elaborate spiritual theater she had constructed around her activities. His questions about her mystical visions were precise and theologically sophisticated, revealing inconsistencies in her accounts that previous confessors had either missed or chosen to ignore. More dangerously, he began asking about specific courtiers and family members, suggesting that rumors of unusual activities within the palace had reached ears in Rome. Isabella's diary reveals her growing panic as she realized that Father Antonio represented a threat, not just to her own carefully maintained deception, but to the entire network of corruption she had helped to sustain and document. His arrival coincided with increasing scrutiny from papal investigators who had been dispatched to examine various aspects of Spanish church administration, creating a perfect storm of external pressure on the Habsburg family's darkest secrets. Her entries describe desperate attempts to manipulate the new confessor, using techniques that had proven successful with his predecessors. She tried claiming divine revelations that would redirect his attention away from sensitive areas, attempted to overwhelm him with elaborate displays of religious ecstasy, and even suggested that his questions themselves might be inspired by demonic influence designed to undermine her spiritual progress. But Father Antonio proved immune to these manipulations. His theological training had apparently included exposure to cases of genuine, mystical experience, giving him the knowledge needed to distinguish between authentic spiritual phenomena and calculated deception. Isabella's diary records his increasingly direct challenges to her claims, questions that forced her to confront the possibility that her years of careful performance might finally be unraveling. The psychological pressure of these encounters began to crack the protective shell Isabella had built around her true thoughts and feelings. Her diary entries from early 1601 show increasing confusion as the boundaries between her performed madness and genuine psychological distress began to blur. She describes moments of genuine religious terror, wondering if her years of sacrilegious deception had indeed invited demonic possession into her soul. These spiritual crises coincided with practical dangers that threatened her physical safety as well as her psychological stability. Isabella's network of informants began reporting increased surveillance of her activities by individuals whose loyalties were unclear. She suspected that Father Antonio had allies within the palace who were systematically investigating her movements and associations, gathering evidence that could be used to expose her true role within the family's criminal enterprises. Her diary reveals that she began taking increasingly desperate measures to protect her archive of evidence, while preparing for the possibility that her own survival might require sacrificing years of careful documentation. She describes creating false caches of documents designed to satisfy investigators, while moving her most damaging evidence to new hiding places that would be accessible to future generations, even if she herself were eliminated. The strain of these preparations pushed Isabella's already fragmented psyche toward complete breakdown. Her diary entries become increasingly paranoid and disjointed, filled with references to shadowy figures who might be agents of the Inquisition, papal spies, or simply products of her own deteriorating mental state. She writes of hearing voices in the palace walls, of seeing faces in mirrors that belong to people long dead, of receiving messages through seemingly random arrangements of objects in her chambers. Yet beneath this apparent madness, her core intelligence remained functional enough to continue her documentation efforts. Isabella began encoding her most sensitive observations in forms that would appear to be the ravings of a religious lunatic, while preserving crucial information for future investigators. She developed a system of mystical symbolism that incorporated real intelligence about Habsburg crimes into what appeared to be theological speculation about the nature of divine justice. Her diary from this period reveals that she had begun to suspect that her mental deterioration was not entirely natural. She describes strange symptoms that appeared after consuming food or drink provided by certain family members, episodes of memory loss that coincided with important family gatherings, and periods of unusual complacence that seemed inconsistent with her normal psychological patterns. Isabella's growing paranoia about poisoning was not entirely unfounded. Her diary documents several instances where family members who had become inconvenient witnesses to criminal activities had died suddenly of mysterious illnesses. She began to understand that her own usefulness to the dynasty was declining as external pressures mounted, making her a potential liability rather than an asset. The realization that she might be marked for elimination triggered a final burst of desperate activity from Isabella. Her diary describes frantic efforts to complete her historical archive, while preparing multiple escape routes that might allow her to flee Spain if her situation became untenable. She reached out to foreign contacts she had cultivated over the years, attempting to negotiate sanctuary in exchange for information that could damage Spanish interests. These escape preparations revealed the full extent of Isabella's transformation from victim to active participant in international espionage. Her diary documents a sophisticated understanding of European political dynamics and extensive knowledge of state secrets that went far beyond anything a cloistered archduchess should have possessed. She had learned to leverage her position within the Habsburg family to gather intelligence that would be invaluable to Spain's enemies. Her most ambitious plan involved making contact with agents of the Dutch Republic who were engaged in their ongoing struggle for independence from Spanish rule. Isabella's diary reveals that she had been secretly providing information to Dutch spies for years, using her access to military planning sessions and diplomatic correspondence to undermine Spanish war efforts. Her motivation appears to have been not political conviction, but pure revenge against the family that had destroyed her life. The complexity of Isabella's espionage activities demonstrates the remarkable intellectual capabilities that had allowed her to survive and even thrive within the toxic environment of the Habsburg court. She had learned to compartmentalize different aspects of her identity so completely that she could simultaneously serve as a loyal family member, a religious mystic, a criminal participant, and a foreign agent without any of these roles interfering with the others. But maintaining these multiple identities required constant vigilance and psychological energy that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. Isabella's diary entries from mid-1601 show signs of exhaustion and confusion, as the various deceptions she was maintaining began to conflict with each other. She describes moments of panic when she could no longer remember which version of events she had told to which audience, creating risks of exposure that threatened all her carefully constructed facades. The arrival of a new Habsburg princess at court provided both opportunity and danger for Isabella's increasingly precarious situation. Princess Margaret of Austria-Styria, arriving for marriage negotiations with Philip III, represented both a potential new victim for the family's exploitation and a possible witness who might expose Isabella's own criminal activities. Isabella's diary reveals her internal struggle over how to handle this situation. Her years of participation in the family's crimes had made her complicit in ways that could result in her own execution if exposed. Yet her original personality, buried but not entirely destroyed, rebelled against the prospect of facilitating another young woman's destruction. Her solution was characteristically complex and morally ambiguous. Isabella decided to provide Princess Margaret with enough information to protect herself while ensuring that the princess's testimony, if it ever became public, would implicate other family members rather than Isabella herself. This required an elaborate manipulation that demonstrated both Isabella's political sophistication and her complete moral corruption. The diary describes Isabella's careful cultivation of Princess Margaret's trust through displays of religious devotion and feminine solidarity. She presented herself as a spiritual mentor who had achieved mystical insights through years of prayer and contemplation, gradually introducing warnings about court life that appeared to be divine revelations rather than practical intelligence. This manipulation required Isabella to perform one of her most challenging psychological balancing acts. She needed to appear genuinely holy while providing specific warnings about sexual predators within the family. She accomplished this by framing her knowledge as visions sent by God to protect the innocent, creating plausible deniability for her possession of information that no cloistered mystic should have known. Princess Margaret's responses to these warnings, carefully documented in Isabella's diary, reveal the psychological mechanisms through which Habsburg women were prepared for exploitation. The young princess had been so thoroughly indoctrinated with concepts of family loyalty and royal duty that she initially interpreted Isabella's warnings as tests of her commitment to Habsburg values, rather than genuine attempts at protection. Isabella's frustration with these responses triggered some of her most revealing diary entries about the systematic psychological conditioning that prepared Habsburg women for victimization. She writes with clinical precision about the techniques used to convince intelligent, strong-willed women that resistance to family demands was not just futile, but morally wrong. Her analysis reveals that the Habsburg system succeeded not through physical coercion alone, but through the creation of elaborate ideological frameworks that made victims complicit in their own exploitation. Women were taught that their suffering served higher purposes, that their sacrifice maintained the divine order that justified Habsburg rule, and that resistance would result in cosmic catastrophe rather than personal liberation. Isabella's diary shows her beginning to understand that her own participation in these crimes had been shaped by the same psychological manipulation she now witnessed being applied to Princess Margaret. This recognition triggered a period of profound self-examination as she grappled with questions of responsibility and guilt that she had previously managed to avoid through dissociation and rationalization. The process of confronting her own victimization while simultaneously acknowledging her role as victimizer pushed Isabella toward what appears to have been a complete psychological breakdown. Her diary entries from late 1601 become increasingly incoherent, filled with religious imagery that may represent genuine spiritual experience, psychological fragmentation, or simply the effects of whatever substances her family had been using to control her behavior. Yet even in the depths of this apparent madness, Isabella continued to document the ongoing crimes around her with obsessive precision. Her fractured mental state seemed to strip away the last vestiges of self-deception, allowing her to record family activities with a clarity and honesty that her previous psychological defenses had prevented. These final coherent entries in Isabella's diary provide the most damning evidence against the Habsburg dynasty that she had spent years accumulating. They describe specific criminal acts with precise dates, locations, and participants, creating a documentary record that would be devastating if it ever became public. More importantly, they reveal the systematic nature of Habsburg corruption and its integration into the fundamental structures of Spanish governance and Catholic religious authority. Isabella's last dated entry, written in December 1601, suggests that she had finally decided to attempt the escape she had been planning for months. She writes of receiving confirmation that Dutch agents were prepared to provide sanctuary in exchange for her accumulated intelligence, and that arrangements had been made to transport her archive of evidence to safety, regardless of whether she survived the journey. The diary ends abruptly with no indication of whether Isabella successfully executed her escape plan or was discovered and eliminated by family members who had grown suspicious of her activities. Historical records show that she disappeared from court life completely in early 1602, with official explanations claiming that she had retired to a convent for health reasons. But Isabella's carefully hidden diary survived, along with substantial portions of her historical archive documenting centuries of Habsburg crimes. The documents were discovered during renovations to the royal palace in 1936, hidden behind false walls and buried in sealed containers that had preserved them through more than 3 centuries of Spanish history. The implications of Isabella's revelations extend far beyond the personal tragedy of her individual story. Her documentation provides evidence of systematic corruption within one of Europe's most powerful dynasties, corruption that influenced major historical events and shaped the development of modern European political structures. Her diary reveals that many of the religious wars, political alliances, and territorial conflicts that defined early modern European history were influenced by the personal pathologies and criminal activities of Habsburg family members. The dynasty's public image as defenders of Catholic orthodoxy and divine order masked private realities that contradicted every principle they claimed to represent. Most disturbing of all, Isabella's evidence suggests that the patterns of exploitation and corruption she documented were not unique to the Spanish Habsburgs, but reflected broader systems of aristocratic privilege that operated throughout European high society. Her correspondence with foreign courts reveals similar networks of sexual exploitation, political manipulation, and religious hypocrisy operating across national and cultural boundaries. The survival of Isabella's diary represents one of history's most remarkable documents of resistance and testimony. Despite years of psychological manipulation, physical abuse, and forced complicity in criminal activities, she managed to preserve evidence that would eventually expose the truth about her tormentors. Her transformation from victim to witness to prosecutor demonstrates the resilience of human intelligence and moral purpose, even in the most corrupted circumstances. Her legacy forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, complicity, and the price of survival in systems designed to crush individual agency. Isabella's story reveals how victims can become perpetrators not through moral failure, but through psychological mechanisms that transform resistance into collaboration as the only path to continued existence. The discovery of her archive in 1936 came at a moment when Spain was again convulsing with political upheaval. Republican scholars who first examined Isabella's documents recognized their explosive potential, but the outbreak of civil war prevented any systematic publication of her revelations. Franco's victory and the subsequent restoration of monarchical symbolism ensured that Isabella's evidence would remain buried for another generation. During World War II, portions of Isabella's archive disappeared entirely, likely destroyed by officials who understood their implications for Spain's carefully constructed historical narrative. The documents that survived were scattered among various repositories, their connections deliberately obscured to prevent anyone from reconstructing the full scope of Isabella's accusations. Modern historians who have attempted to verify Isabella's claims face significant obstacles. Many of the palace locations she describes were destroyed or extensively renovated over the centuries, eliminating physical evidence that might corroborate her accounts. Church records that might confirm her allegations about clerical complicity have been sealed or have mysteriously vanished from archives. Yet, forensic analysis of Isabella's handwriting, the paper and ink she used, and the linguistic patterns in her cipher have convinced most scholars that her diary is authentic. The psychological sophistication of her self-analysis and the accurate historical details she provides about court life during her era strongly suggest that these are genuine contemporary accounts rather than later fabrications. The cipher Isabella developed to protect her most sensitive observations has only recently been fully decoded. Computer analysis revealed that she incorporated multiple layers of encryption, using not just letter substitutions but mathematical sequences, astronomical references, and theological symbolism to create messages within messages. Her intellectual sophistication rivals that of professional cryptographers of her era. Hidden within these decoded passages are references to what Isabella calls the Great Accounting, a final reckoning she believed would eventually expose all Habsburg crimes to divine and human judgment. She appears to have viewed her documentary efforts as contributions to this cosmic justice, preserving evidence that would survive even if earthly authorities failed to act on her revelations. Isabella's understanding of historical forces was remarkably prescient. She predicted that the Habsburg dynasty would eventually collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, that the sexual exploitation and psychological damage she documented would produce successive generations of increasingly dysfunctional rulers who would prove incapable of maintaining their empire. Her analysis of the genetic and psychological consequences of systematic inbreeding proved accurate in ways that wouldn't be scientifically understood for centuries. Isabella observed that Habsburg children were becoming increasingly prone to physical deformities, mental instability, and emotional disorders that she correctly attributed to the family's obsession with bloodline purity. The Archduchess documented specific examples of how psychological trauma was transmitted across generations, creating cycles of abuse that became embedded in the dynasty's operational culture. She noted that family members who had themselves been victimized often became the most ruthless perpetrators, suggesting that survival within the system required the complete suppression of empathy and normal human emotional responses. Her observations about the relationship between political power and sexual exploitation anticipated modern understanding of how authoritarian systems use control over intimate life to maintain broader social dominance. Isabella recognized that the Habsburg family's sexual crimes weren't separate from their political authority, but were integral to the psychological mechanisms that sustained their rule. The international dimensions of Isabella's revelations suggest that she had uncovered evidence of what modern investigators would recognize as an organized criminal enterprise operating under the cover of legitimate governmental authority. Her correspondence describes coordination between Habsburg territories in different countries, suggesting that sexual exploitation was being systematized across the entire dynastic network. Documents she preserved indicate that victims were sometimes transported between different Habsburg courts based on their particular psychological vulnerabilities or physical characteristics. This trafficking operation appears to have been managed with the same bureaucratic efficiency that the family applied to their legitimate governmental functions. Isabella's archive includes detailed financial records showing how the costs of maintaining this exploitation network were hidden within official palace budgets. Payments to madams, doctors who performed illegal abortions, and assassins who eliminated inconvenient witnesses were disguised as legitimate administrative expenses, creating a parallel economy dedicated to sustaining the dynasty's criminal activities. The scope of corruption Isabella documented extended into the highest levels of the Catholic Church hierarchy. She preserved correspondence between Habsburg family members and various bishops, cardinals, and even papal representatives that reveals systematic bribery, blackmail, and complicity in covering up sexual crimes against women and children. These religious officials weren't merely passive enable authority to facilitate exploitation. Isabella describes her as but active participants who used their spiritual ceremonies where church rituals were perverted into tools for psychological manipulation, with sacred symbols and religious language used to convince victims that their suffering served divine purposes. The theological justifications developed by corrupt clergy to rationalize Habsburg crimes represent some of the most disturbing content in Isabella's entire archive. These documents reveal elaborate doctrinal arguments claiming that royal blood carried special spiritual properties that exempted Habsburg family members from ordinary moral restrictions. Isabella's analysis of these religious corruptions demonstrates her sophisticated understanding of how institutional authority could be weaponized against vulnerable individuals. She recognized that the combination of political power and spiritual authority created nearly insurmountable barriers to resistance, as victims were convinced that challenging their abusers meant challenging God himself. Her diary reveals that she attempted to reach out to reform-minded elements within the church who might have been willing to challenge these corruptions. She describes carefully coded communications with Jesuit scholars and Franciscan mystics who had expressed concerns about moral decay within the Spanish church hierarchy. These reform contacts provided Isabella with theological frameworks for understanding her situation that differed from the corrupted doctrines promoted by Habsburg allies. She began to develop her own spiritual interpretation of events that framed her documentary efforts as a form of religious witness rather than political rebellion. This religious reframing appears to have provided Isabella with the psychological strength needed to continue her dangerous work, despite mounting pressures from family members who had grown suspicious of her activities. She began to see herself as an instrument of divine justice, chosen to preserve evidence that would eventually bring accountability to those who had escaped earthly punishment. The mystical experiences Isabella describes in her later diary entries may represent genuine spiritual phenomena, psychological coping mechanisms, or simply the effects of whatever substances her family had been using to control her behavior. Regardless of their ultimate nature, these experiences provided her with a framework for understanding her suffering that transcended the immediate circumstances of her exploitation. Her religious visions consistently emphasized themes of hidden truth being revealed, of secret sins being exposed to divine light, and of justice being administered to those who had abused positions of trust and authority. These themes suggest that Isabella's spiritual life had become organized around her mission to document and expose Habsburg crimes. The final entries in Isabella's diary suggest that she had achieved a form of peace with her situation, not through acceptance of her abuse, but through confidence that her documentary efforts would outlive both herself and her tormentors. She writes of feeling liberated by the knowledge that truth preserved in writing could survive the destruction of those who had created and witnessed it. Isabella's transformation from terrified victim to methodical documentarian to mystical witness represents one of the most remarkable psychological journeys recorded in historical literature. Her story demonstrates how human intelligence and moral purpose can survive and even triumph over systematic attempts to destroy individual agency and dignity. The preservation of her archive through centuries of political upheaval, war, and deliberate suppression suggests that her faith in the power of documented truth was not misplaced. Her diary has become exactly what she intended, a weapon of historical justice that continues to expose the reality behind carefully constructed official narratives. Modern readers of Isabella's diary face the same challenge that confronted her original contemporaries, reconciling the enormity of her accusations with their implications for understanding how power operates in supposedly civilized societies. Her revelations force us to question comfortable assumptions about the relationship between public virtue and private behavior among those who claim moral and political authority. Isabella's story ends where it began, in shadows and whispers that echo through marble corridors centuries after her disappearance. Her diary stands as testament to the human capacity for both unimaginable cruelty and extraordinary resilience, a document that transforms victimhood into witness and suffering into historical justice. The Archduchess who once trembled at her writing desk became the prosecutor of an empire, her encrypted words more powerful than any army that ever served the Habsburg crown. In those hidden pages, we discover that the greatest scandals aren't always the ones history chooses to remember, but the ones brave enough souls refuse to let us forget.